You can't stop. You got to sing that song. Every time it comes on, it's like living on a prayer last week, right? It's like, if you missed that one, woo, you missed a good one. That was fun. How you doing? All right, that's not too bad. Not too bad for a bit of rain out there. I'm going to grab a guitar here, and hopefully I still have my pick with me. Oh, there it is, yep. So, we are in the middle, like smack dab, in the middle of a series that we're calling Summer Playlist, right? So we've gone through a number of different things. We set up at the very beginning why we're doing it, you know, the idea of there being no sacred, no secular. Doesn't matter, there's neither, right? We talked about those sort of things. We worked through some things. Dave did yesterday. We did Don't Stop Believin'. Last week we did Living on a Prayer, and today we're going to do a fun song too. It might be a little bit less known, but chances are you have heard this song before. So Joanna, if you can give me that, give me the G there, right? Turn it up. There we go. Ready? A little bit more. It's got to have that, music bed, because it's a big song, and I think this is one of those great songs where you just turn it on and you feel better already. I'm just going to sing the first verse. If Steve were up here, he'd be going dun, 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 on his bass, right? Kind of goes like this. I will be king, and you will be queen. When nothing would drive them away, we can be heroes just for one day. We can be heroes just for one day. I wish I could swim like the dolphins. I won't keep going. That's how it goes. I know. Sorry. We can do more later. Big song. How many of you have not ever, you think, ever heard that song before? Oh my goodness. Dave, we got some work to do. And they got some splaining to do. All right, let me get that behind me. Okay, so what's the song called? Heroes. Okay, now, who by? David Bowie. Okay, David Bowie is the one that wrote this song to begin with. Now, he wrote it in 1977. It was the title track of an album that they released, which was actually in sort of homage to a what they called krautrock band. That's not a derogatory term. I apologize, Masha. But there was this whole group of rock in the 60s and 70s that you can go back and actually watch documentaries about these guys. Incredible stuff, and they were inspired especially by this one track by a band called New, N-E-W, however you say that, called Hero. And so a few years later, they were actually in West Berlin. This is where they recorded this whole album, and they put together this song called Heroes. Now, when it was released, it wasn't all that popular. It didn't do too well on the charts. It was just sort of like it was there, sort of David Bowie. Talking with my wife this week, it's not. For those of us who really don't get into David Bowie, chances are there's like a handful of tracks we might actually know. He's a little bit more artistic. He's sort of like an artist that does music instead of a musician that does arts, that kind of stuff. But anyway, so he released this song back then. It didn't do too well. However, mid-'90s, along comes Godzilla, the movie, and Jacob Dylan and the Wallflowers released a cover of this song. That was actually my introduction to the song. I'd never heard it before that. Right? So mid-'90s, that happens. Then 2016, David Bowie died. And as a result, as we've seen with all these other tracks that we've been talking about, for some reason, they enter the tracks because some event happens. So something that's released in the 1977, 81, 86, I think it was. All these things sort of come back again, and again. So 2016, he died, and it actually re-entered the charts and did as high as number 12 in the UK. More recently, however, there were two things. One is a film that I really, really like. You don't have to go watch this, but it's got The Perks of Being a Wallflower, 2012. I really like this film. I actually really wanted to use this clip today because it's like I watched this clip and I feel like they do in the clip. Sort of like they feel infinite. They climbing on the back of a pickup, riding through a tunnel. Just cranking this song because this is makes them feel like heroes. These bunch of misfits. So that was 2012. But then more recently, I even heard it on a show last night. What TV series, or I guess Netflix series now, has used it? No, you're not allowed to answer. Stranger Things. Stranger Things actually uses it. Peter Gabriel, another artist-turned-musician, he actually uses a very, very different, heavy, melancholic version of it. But even in there, if you've watched Stranger Things, seasons 1, 2, and 3, you've heard this song. So that's the song that we're actually sort of bouncing off of. Now, when we talk about heroes, usually we're talking, we talk superheroes. We've had a lot of those the last number of years. We even did a series on superheroes and us a couple years ago, back in 2017. Or we're talking about maybe, soldiers, firefighters, policemen, or maybe even bystanders that sort of leap into action to do something extraordinary, especially when somebody is in imminent danger. That's usually the kind of stuff we think about when we hear the word hero. But the other way of looking at this word hero is actually in the context of story. Every story has a hero. If you're strictly a purist, literarian person, you might say the protagonist. But we're not going to use the protagonist. Hero is more fun, more interesting, more dynamic, right? Every story that's good has a hero. And in every good story, the hero will go through several stages. If it's a good story. If he doesn't go through a bunch of these stages, it's not exactly a cut and paste. It's not like a formula, but there tend to be these stages that they go through. So you can rearrange some of these things. Some of them you could remove and you can still have a good story. But the hero will usually go through most of these sort of things. The thing that becomes called a hero's journey. A guy by the name of Joseph Campbell, he actually wrote a book in the mid-20th century called Hero with a Thousand Faces. And what he did is he looked at mythology and stories globally, across civilization, across culture, across time. And what he began to observe was that there were these stages of a hero's journey in the story. Again and again through all of time. But then Christopher Vogler, back in the 80s, he was working for Disney at the time, I think. And Disney was not making good films in the 80s. They were doing some really, really bad stuff, losing money left, right, and center. But Christopher Vogler, he'd been looking at a movie that we're actually going to talk about in a few moments, and he'd seen some of the stuff that they were using and some of the elements of story through this sort of whole thing. And he'd been reading, Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, and he puts these sort of things together and writes a 7-page memo that ends up on Jeffrey Katzenberg's desk. It's hard for me because I have Katzenbergers here. So it ends up on his desk, and he ends up getting hired as a consultant for many, many Disney films ever since. So all of a sudden, films that you've probably heard of, like Lion King, Aladdin, all these sort of things that it started in the late 80s, early 90s, these were all as a result of Disney revisiting what actually makes a good story and what are the elements that are there. Now, I have these elements here, and I actually had a slide where I had all of the elements of the hero's journey and the parallel, this sort of, I'm not doing a lecture. That's boring. So what I figured it would be more fun to do is this. I actually have some pictures from a movie that hopefully many of you have actually seen. My wife hasn't even seen that I've done this yet. All right, so you're going to look at the pictures, and I'm going to tell you what's going on there, and you're going to begin to understand, because this is the film that he was looking at, the series of films that Christopher Vogler was looking at to understand what makes a good story. This will make sense as we go, all right? So, first slide. Who is he? Luke Skywalker. Okay, from Star Wars, this is the beginning of A New Hope. I need to move? All right, you can't see there? I'll take this with me. All right, I'll sit down here. There we go. Okay. You can look at the picture. It's more interesting. All right, so you got Luke Skywalker there. You've got you're introduced to an ordinary world. It's just the world he lives in. And he's bored out of his mind farming water vapor. I think that's what they're farming. I'm not really sure what those things are. I think that's what they're doing, right? So he's really bored. That's the world that we're introduced to. But then he has a call to adventure in the form of the hologram with Princess Leia. And asking Obi-Wan to help, and he doesn't even know who Obi-Wan Kenobi is, and his uncle tells him he's probably dead, and all this kind of stuff. But then he meets Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the hero's reluctant at first. Luke turns down Obi-Wan's offer for adventure, for what Obi-Wan Kenobi is telling him is his destiny. 4, the hero is encouraged by a wise old man or woman or a mentor or guide, maybe a good word. Obi-Wan gives advice to Luke and gives him his father's lightsaber, but the mentor can only go so far with the hero. If I'm skipping the slide, don't worry, sorry, I'll just jump back there. The threshold, do I have that one there? There you go. He passes the threshold where he discovers that the thing that's holding him back, his aunt and uncle, they're dead. He now has nothing holding him back, and he's going to go. The hero encounters tests and helpers. The infamous scene in the cantina. Harrison Ford said Han Solo shot first, just so you know. He meets all sorts of strange creatures here, including Han Solo and Chewbacca. Yeah. Hero reaches the innermost cave. All right, so Luke and Han rescue Leia. They go deep into the detention center in the great big, I think it was in the Death Star, and they rescue Leia out of there. But of course, they're not quite done yet. Luke and company, so they go into the Death Star, and it looks like they're all gonna get killed in the next slide, in the trash compactor. Hero endures the supreme ordeal. Looks like they're all gonna die. There's no possible way for them to get out of there. Is there? Number 9 is hero seizes the sword. Now, through the series, you'll actually begin to see some of these things more, because typically the hero seizes the sword, is resolving a conflict with an enemy or a person. It could be somebody getting back with their girlfriend, could be that kind of stuff. But in this case, he's reconciling with his father and his enemy, right? But that's in the 3rd film, but they play with this motif through there. Just jumping back a little bit. The road back, Luke, Leia, and others escape the Death Star with plans to bring down Vader, and they're escaping now, shooting the TIE fighters as they're being chased. 11, resurrection. Now, this is something that all 3 Star Wars films, the only ones that really matter, all 3 of them play with this idea where it looks like Luke is dead, or there's no possible way he could survive the circumstances he's in, frequently with him hanging upside down. But in every case, he survives miraculously, and he's transformed by the experience. And of course, the result is, and when he returns with the elixir, the thing that brings them back, is Luke and the company return with plans for the Death Star, and as a result, when they destroy the Death Star, freedom and democracy are once again restored, albeit temporarily, or somewhat fleetingly, for a short period of time. So those are all the elements that we sort of break down into the essential components of a story. But to really break it down to you, Donald Miller, who works with story a lot, he's a writer and works on this stuff for a living, he says story is a character who wants something and overcomes conflict to get it. That's the basis, that's the crux of story. Now, story is probably about the most effective means of communication we have. There's something about story with humans, no matter what culture, no matter what time you're from, that resonates, that seems to resonate deep within our soul. Something about story, we see something in it, the hero in it, maybe we identify with it, we want that life. We want to be able to do something heroic, or at least be like that hero, or at the very least, we know we want our lives to mean something, at least in the way that the hero's life seems to mean something in the story that we're actually following. And then we wake up and we go to work. Because there's no way that we can live like that, right? Or is there? Every one of us is living story right now. Every one of us is living a story. Your story, your life, is the story of you. How would you describe the story that you're living? Is it a comedy? Is it an action adventure? Is it a horror film? Some of you probably saying yes. Or is it a French existentialist film? Everything is stupid. I killed the dog because he's stupid. Sort of like what French films look like in American films. Is it the kind of story that when you watch the hero, you're getting angry at him or frustrated with him because of the decisions that they're making, the things that they're doing, or the decisions they're not making and the things that they're not doing? Is it that kind of story that you're actually living? Is your life a good story? At the end of your life and the credits roll on that film, what do you want to have people left with? Do you want people saying, oh, he lived a good life, just like everybody else. She was nothing out of the ordinary. They played it safe and wanted the exact same thing as everybody else. What a life. Is that the kind of life you want? Think about that for a second. You are the hero of your story. Nobody else is the hero of your story. And if somebody else is the hero of your story, you're doing it wrong. And you need to start living like the hero of your story. What kind of story is it? What story is it going to be? Because it's not over yet, and you get to choose now what it's actually going to be. God has given each one of you, each one of us, a unique place in time and history. He's given you certain gifts and abilities. And now, while there may be many ways that we are almost identical, almost exactly the same, where we're barely unique from moment to moment to moment, some of the individual things that we experience, the collection of all those things, the gifts and abilities, your background, your experiences, all of these things coming together make you a unique individual. Your journey is unique. Nobody else is living the journey and living the story the way that you are, but many of us are trying to live and be exactly like somebody else. You are denying the uniqueness of what God has given to you. We know we want to do something significant, or at least we say that we want our lives to mean something. We actually want to do something great, but then we turn around and we actually try to blend into the crowd as much as possible. Where is your life going? Are you going anywhere? Is the plot moving? Author Donald Miller, like I mentioned just a moment ago, he says there are 3 questions that anybody has to ask, anybody that sits down with him, and they're going to be talk about living a great story. There's 3 questions that he poses to them right off the bat. And these are the 3 questions you start with. Who are you? What do you want? What's the first step? Who are you? What do you want? And what's the first step? Those sound like really simple questions. But I think we probably get really stuck on the first one. Because who are we really? We struggle to identify, to define who we are. Partly because we begin to define our successes, we define ourselves by our successes or our failures. We define ourselves by our shame and our fears. When those things really should never have been defining us in the first place. We get too high, we get too low. It doesn't really work. We define ourselves by somebody else or the relationship that we have with them. But if that's how we define ourselves, then it will never, ever be a stable definition of self. Because it's the lack of identity that leads to many of the problems in our life. If you have no idea who you are, then you will never have stability, peace, direction, or live with any purpose in life. It's just not possible unless you live out of who you are. As followers of Jesus, and even for people who aren't followers of Jesus, we think we are who Jesus says we are. Anything else is a lie. Because if the creator of the universe created us a certain way, and that's what we believe has happened, then he should be the one who defines who we are. He should be the one that defines how we understand ourselves. We look at Ephesians 1. Eugene Peterson's paraphrase in the Message, I love how poetic it is. That's why I'm using that one. It's in Christ that we find out who we are and what we are living for. Long before we first heard of Christ and got our hopes up, he had his eye on us, had designs on us for glorious living. Part of the overall purpose he is working out in everything and everyone. Everything and everyone. you are loved, you are valued, and you choose to accept it from him as a free gift, you are also forgiven, and therefore a child of God. And because he never changes, if we root our identity in what he says about us, then our definition of ourself will not change either. The definition of self remains stable. You need to be you. You can't be somebody else. Living out of who you are will help you live a life of peace and live a great story, which most of us want to do. All three of our questions that we're looking at there, who are you, what do you want, and what's the first step, are somewhat addressed in the passage that we're going to look at this morning. From Matthew 14, you can follow along on the screen. We'll have it all up there, but if you'd like to follow along on your phone or in your Bible, you can do that too. Last week, it starts with a reference to what we talked about last week, the idea of living on a prayer. And it starts like this, immediately, and you're thinking, whoa, what happened? Your FOMO kicks in. You know, this is immediately after what we know as the feeding of the 5,000. I'll mention more about that in a second. I like to remind people about that. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. So this is the first time that Jesus has involved his disciples directly in a miracle that he's performed. The feeding of the 5,000, when the 5,000 refers to what? Say it louder. Men, all right? That's not a derogatory thing. It's just that way they counted them. So we know that there were also women and children. So we're probably talking 10,000, potentially more. There's a lot of people that they just fed. And they're probably feeling pretty good about themselves right now because they just participated in a miracle. They're feeling pretty good about themselves. Maybe this is why Jesus is saying, okay, you guys got to go now, right? So this is what he says here. He makes them go on ahead of him. Get out of here, guys. You need to leave now. After he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. This is sort of what we talked about last week. Later that night, he was there alone. Jesus making a pattern. There's a pattern in Jesus' life. Making time to pray. Repeatedly, as you read through the Gospels, you'll see that Jesus, there's some big stuff happening, especially some large things. And what does he do almost immediately afterwards? He goes away and spends time in prayer. A pattern that we ought to try to emulate. Jesus was living on a prayer. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. So how many hours has it been now? We're talking 6 to 9, possibly more hours that they're out on this lake. And this isn't just a little lake. This isn't just like, I don't know, like the lake in Polomokotovskia. This is a big lake here. Yeah, I think you're talking about, it's about 9 miles by 13 miles, so I think that's about 12 kilometers by 21 kilometers or something like that, slightly pear-shaped. No pun intended. This is what it's going for them. But it's a large lake, and specifically because of its geography, it acts as though it's even bigger than it is. Some would actually say that the storms on the Sea of Galilee could potentially be more dangerous and bigger than the storms on the Mediterranean, simply because of its geography, the topography, all these sort of things going on. And the disciples, we've seen them in the storms at other points too. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, Jesus, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. How well do you see the world around you when you are physically, mentally, and emotionally tired? Probably not too well. I know I can speak for myself. I'm not seeing the world too well. You just do not see the world very well when you're scared. So the disciples here are probably not in a good emotional space or mental space here. They are not calm, cool, calm, and collected at this point. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." This is the command that we read in Scripture more than absolutely any other command. 366 times from beginning to end of what we call the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, 366 times, enough for one for every day in a leap year. You've got to do not be afraid, fear not, like this kind of stuff, right? Take courage. Like this is the kind of thing, repeatedly, all these sort of times. And then, in this situation, Peter gets one of his ideas. This just seems really, really silly when you read this. You're thinking, Peter, like, what are you doing? Like, are you doing something when we're not looking? Because, this is just kind of nuts. Why would he ever think of this? What happened in his mind that he got to asking the question he's about to ask? What happened in his mind that led him to say, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water"? Where does that come from? There are so many more logical responses that Peter could have used, in this particular situation. Maybe something like, hey, Jesus, glad you're here. Hop in. We'd love to have your help with the rowing. You're our God, after all. So, you could do that kind of stuff. Or maybe, Jesus, would you like a ride? Maybe you'll get there faster if you walk, But like a 2-year-old, Peter says, I want to walk on water. Where does that come from? When a 2-year-old tells you that they want to drive your car, or they want to pet the gorilla in the zoo, you generally will try to explain to them, potentially, 10 times before they realize it's a losing battle. You're going to explain to them why you can't go in and pet the gorilla in the zoo. And he's not all that friendly, even though he looks really cute. If one of your friends told you that they wanted to pet the gorilla in the zoo, you'd probably wonder about their mental health. Besides, there's all the logistics of getting into the gorilla pen, and then, it's just, it's difficult. But Peter says, I want to walk on water. You're like, Peter, what's wrong with you? Like, where did that come from? But that's not how Jesus responds. He indulges Peter. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. We usually imagine Jesus is really stoic, like he never smiles, he never laughs. It's always this because this is more holy to be like this. We're actually going to talk about some of that next week, so be here. This is sort of how we imagine him here, But Peter has, like almost robotic, but Peter has asked something here absolutely bizarre. Where in the world did that come from? And Jesus is like, yes, let's do it. That'll be fun. Like, that's the response that Jesus gives to him. And Peter's like, yes, this is going to be awesome. He hops out in the water. And I wonder if when he started walking, if he was, how did he walk? Because it's like, you don't walk on water that many times, right? So it's like, he gets out there and maybe, he's just trying to keep it cool. Or I don't know, maybe he's like, you're out there, and maybe I sort of imagine people, the way people learn to skate, you sort of like the stiff leg, or maybe he's dance walking, or I don't know what they would dance, maybe like, if I were a rich man, I don't know. He'd get out there and do something, I don't know how he was walking, but I was just wondering. There you go. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. The only reason Peter considered doing something that is impossible to do was because he knew that Jesus was trustworthy. There's no other reason for him to have done it. When he stepped out of the boat, who he was and what he was defined by the person to whom he was about to walk. That's where his eyes were fixed. That's how he was actually beginning to defining himself. He was defining himself by that relationship. But when he took his eyes off Jesus, he looked around and began to allow his circumstances, his surroundings to define who he was, because that's what they were doing. He began to sink in his own fear. His definition of self, his identity changed from who Jesus said he was to who he thought he was and what his surroundings told him he was. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? Now, I don't hear this as some rebuke or in a stern way. Keep in mind, there's 11 other dudes sitting in the boat. They didn't hop out. They weren't the ones that stepped out in courage. The other 11 were just sort of living like everybody else, sit in the boat, safe and comfortable. Don't rock the boat. Don't get out of it. Be like everybody else. And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. It was only for a few moments that Peter was out there. But how many other people in human history have gotten the opportunity to walk on water? And notice that this was not something that Jesus said, hey, Peter, get out here, walk on the water. He didn't say that at all. He just told them he was there and not to be afraid. Peter's the one who came up with the idea. I was like, hey, I want to walk on water. Jesus, bring it on, let's go. And that brings us to the second question. What do you want? And seriously, what do you want? God is not going to be surprised by you telling him something that you actually honestly want, that maybe you've been trying to keep from him. He already knows. So he's not going to be surprised when you actually tell him. You might as well tell him. I think he genuinely wants to hear from you what the desires of your heart are. What are you really looking for? What are you hoping for? What are you wishing for in life? He genuinely wants to hear what you want. It doesn't mean you're going to get everything you want, but I believe that he desperately wants to hear what you do want. It's part of the relationship. And if you're not asking something that's going to contradict God's moral will and his providential will, we talked about those a number of weeks ago, if it's not going to violate, if it's something you know you shouldn't do, you don't need to pray about it. It's just don't do it, right? If it's something you know you should do, then you do it. But there's this other area, and when we talk about the personal will, when we talk about wanting to follow God's will, it's usually like we're expecting there to be a script that we're going to be handed. Upon entry to the family of God, here's your script. You're going to read this and you're going to follow along. Imagine this, if you will. You're about to sit down for dinner with your family, and we're going to imagine you've got all the members of your family, father, mother, everybody, right? They're all there, and if father tells, standing in the dining room, he says, all right, come on in. I want you to sit there. I want you to sit there. I want you to sit there. You, over there. Now, all right, you can sit down. You sit down. You sit down. You sit down. You sit down. Okay, we're all down. Great. What we're going to do here, we're going to have dinner come in, and then we're going to have a conversation. You're going to say this. 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 You're going to say, and then we're going to have a really, really good time. Like, what would you call that if that actually happened in your family or somebody else's family? You'd call it dysfunction. You'd call it dysfunction. What kind of father would do that kind of stuff? But God has placed in you gifts, abilities, passions, desires, and so much more that he actually expects you to use. And what you have is never going to be the exact same as somebody next to you has. So what if God, like the good father that he is actually sort of laying out this big paper on the table, like you're a 3-year-old or 4-year-old, just laying it out on the table. And he gives you a great big box of crayons and says, here's the crayons. Draw me what you'd like to do. Draw what you'd like. What if you're sitting there asking God what to do, and he's actually saying to you, what do you want to do? And maybe when we're doing maybe something you want to do, then along that way, I'll use the experiences, both positive and negative, because they're going to happen, to bond with you and shape you and to change your character to become more and more the person I desire you to be. What if that's what God wanted to do? Peter said, I want to walk on water. Jesus is awesome. Let's do that together. You would have thought Peter had asked for ice cream. It's like, yeah, let's go. Let's do this. What do you want? Building on last week's idea of simple prayer, you sort of start with where you are. You start with what you are. You bring that to him too. Because if what you're asking reflects the passions and abilities he's put in you, then he'll help correct anything that needs to be corrected. And if you're listening to him as you should be, then you'll also understand that as you go. Live your life. Don't be ordinary. Don't follow the path of least resistance. Because the moment you choose to follow the path of least resistance, you have chosen to live beneath your potential for the rest of your life. Or at least until you change your mind. If you choose to follow the path of least resistance, you will never measure up to the potential that God has placed in you. An easy life does not equal a life well lived. An easy life is an unchanged life. And an unchanged life is a wasted life. Imagine that you meet Jesus at the end of your life and he takes you into a room and he pulls out a USB drive, or I don't know what they use in heaven, but it's labeled, what could have been, what might have been. And Jesus says, what I want to do is, let me show you, what I could have done with your life, or we could have done with your life if you'd actually let us do that. I want to show you the amazing adventure that we could have had if you'd been willing to lean into that and let us do it. He would never do that. That's not his character. But just think about what potential your life actually does have. Think of the story that your life could be. Think about the adventure that you could have with God if you let him unleash the potential he has placed on you. And that brings me to the final question. What's the first step? What is the next step? What is the next step to living a great story? But I'm going to leave that one with you, because you need to sort out the first two before you can answer this one. What do you need to do? Who do you need to talk to? What do you need to change? What decisions do you need to make? Because if you want to walk on water, you've got to get out of the boat. You can't do it sitting in comfort and safety inside the boat. In story, great characters take action, and they are changed because of it. Just like Peter, it took courage and vulnerability to take action. But his life was changed forever because of it. And you benefit because of the steps that he took. The step that he took that day and was changed forever because of it.